you ever woken up to a sound that you couldn't explain? One that seemed too close, too real? I did, and it changed everything. It was a rainy night in Kyoto, and I was staying in an old ryokan that had been passed down through generations of my family. The innkeeper, my distant cousin, warned me not to sleep in the east room on the second floor. That room, she said in a hushed voice, belongs to her. When I asked who her was, she merely shook her head and muttered, "You will know if you meet her." Curiosity, of course, got the better of me. The east room called to me with its faded tatami mats and a single cracked mirror resting on an antique dresser. As I settled in, the rain battered the roof like whispers from another world. I convinced myself it was just an old wives' tale and lay down to sleep. But then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. My heart raced as I opened my eyes, finding nothing but the rain streaking the glass. I exhaled, telling myself it was just the storm. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved, closer. Then I saw it. A woman in a crimson wedding kimono standing at the foot of my futon. Her face was obscured by a blood-red veil, and her hands were clasped tightly around an ivory comb. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. She didn't move, yet the air in the room thickened, suffocating me with the stench of damp earth and decay. "But why?" I croaked, as though my voice could unravel her story. She tilted her head, the veil shifting slightly to reveal empty, blackened sockets where her eyes should have been. But then, she whispered, "I waited, and he never came." Her voice was brittle, like the crackling of ancient parchment. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. She began to glide closer, her movements unnatural, as if her joints were twisted. She thrust the ivory comb into my hand, and I felt a jolt of searing cold spread through my palm. "Give this to him, or join me beneath the veil." Her figure dissolved like smoke, leaving behind the faint smell of incense and something metallic. The comb remained in my hand, its surface etched with a name, but it wasn't mine. I left the ryokan the next morning, my belongings hastily packed. The comb? It stayed with me. No matter where I threw it away, it always found its way back. And every night since, the tapping returns, growing louder, more insistent. I have one question now, the same one I had that night. Who is him, and what will happen if I never find him? Have you ever seen a face in the dark that wasn't supposed to be there? I have, and I still can't close my eyes without seeing her. It happened during Obon, the festival of spirits. My friends and I decided to take a shortcut through an overgrown path leading to a small abandoned village outside Kyoto. The locals warned us about the lantern woman, but we laughed it off. After all, what's a festival without a ghost story? The path was silent except for the chirping of cicadas, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet grass and moss. As we walked, a faint glow appeared ahead, a single paper lantern swaying in the breeze. But then, the lantern moved. A woman emerged from the darkness, holding the lantern in her bony hands. Her kimono was tattered, the fabric soaked and clinging to her frame as if she had just crawled out of a river. Her face was pale, too pale, and her black eyes seemed to reflect nothing at all. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice like wind rustling through dead leaves. My friends didn't answer. They couldn't. We were frozen, rooted to the spot as she glided closer, the lantern casting flickering shadows that danced unnaturally on the trees around us. But then, she smiled. Her lips stretched wide, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Her lantern's glow shifted to a sickly green, and the light seemed to seep into her skin, illuminating the veins beneath. She raised her free hand, long nails dripping with something dark and thick, and pointed at me. "You, who light the way for the next," she whispered. Before I could scream, she blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed us, and I heard the sound of splashing water, footsteps moving away, and a faint, echoing laugh. When I woke up, I was alone at the edge of the path. My friends were gone, their footprints vanishing where the dirt turned to mud. I ran back to the village, breathless and frantic, but no one believed me. No one except an old man who handed me a lantern. "She chooses one every Obon," he said grimly. "Carry this, or she'll come back for you." Now, every year during Obon, I light the lantern and walk the path alone, because I know if I don't, she'll find me. Hey, have you ever felt like the darkness was watching you, waiting for you to step just a little too close? I did, and I'll never walk in the dark again. It started when I stayed at my grandmother's house in a remote village in Hokkaido. She always warned me not to go outside after sunset, especially near the old well in the forest. She called it the Mouth of Shadows and said it was cursed, but she never explained why. Being the city kid I was, I dismissed it as gruesome superstition. One evening, bored of the dimly lit house, I decided to go for a walk. The forest path was lined with tall cedar trees, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air felt colder the deeper I went, and the silence became oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. But then, I heard it. A faint, raspy voice calling my name from the direction of the well. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, repeating my name in a dry, hungry whisper. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The well stood in a small clearing, covered in moss and surrounded by broken wooden planks. The air around it was freezing, and the shadows seemed to ripple unnaturally, like ink spreading through water. But then, the shadows moved. A hand, or something that looked like a hand, reached out from the darkness within the well. Its fingers were impossibly long, clawed, and black as night. It gripped the edge of the well, pulling itself up. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, watching in horror as a figure emerged. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body wrapped in writhing shadows that seemed alive. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, except for a jagged, tooth-filled mouth that split open into a grotesque grin. "You called me here," it hissed. "Now you must feed me." I turned and ran, the trees blurring around me. The shadows stretched out, clawing at my legs, pulling me back. I screamed as I broke free and bolted back to my grandmother's house, slamming the door behind me. My grandmother was waiting, her face pale but unsurprised. She handed me a small talisman, placing it firmly in my hand. "It saw you. It won't stop now," she said. "Keep this with you, or it will take you." That was months ago. The talisman kept me safe for a while, but now it's starting to crack, and every night I hear my name again, whispered from the corners of the dark. Have you ever driven alone at night and felt like you weren't really alone? I did, and I'll never drive that road again. Balete Drive is infamous in Manila for its ghost stories, but I thought they were just urban legends. That changed one night, when I borrowed my cousin's car to head home late after a party. It was a quiet night, and the road was eerily empty. The gnarled Balete trees lining the street cast long, twisting shadows under the flickering streetlights. But then, I saw her. At first, it was just a flash of white in the corner of my eye. A woman standing by the side of the road. She was barefoot, dressed in a long, tattered white gown that fluttered as if caught in a breeze, though the air was completely still. Her face was turned away, her long black hair hiding most of her features. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to stop, but something deep inside screamed at me to keep going. I pressed the accelerator, refusing to look back. But then, she was in my rearview mirror. She sat silently in the back seat, her hair draped over her face like a veil. My chest tightened as the air in the car grew icy, my breath fogging the windshield. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Her presence was suffocating, heavy, as if the weight of her sorrow was crushing me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so faint it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I couldn't look at her, couldn't turn around. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and muttered a desperate prayer my grandmother had taught me. As I recited the words, the car began to shake violently, the lights flickering as if the battery were draining. But then, she laughed. It was a hollow, bitter sound that echoed in the small space. I felt her icy breath on my neck before the car lurched forward, and just like that, she was gone. The air warmed, the shaking stopped, and the road ahead was clear. When I got home, my cousin was waiting at the door, pale as a sheet. "You didn't take Balete Drive, did you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The scratches on the back seat of her car told her everything she needed to know. Have you ever met someone whose smile wasn't quite right? I did, and I wish I hadn't. It was late one evening in Osaka, and I was hurrying home after work. My shortcut took me through a narrow, dimly lit alley known for strange rumors. People whispered about the Kuchisake nonna, the slit-mouthed woman, but I always dismissed it as an old folk tale meant to scare kids. The alley was eerily silent, the only sound coming from my footsteps on the damp pavement. Halfway through, I saw her. A woman in a long beige coat, standing under a flickering streetlight. She wore a surgical mask, which wasn't unusual, but something about the way she stood, too still, too stiff, made my skin crawl. But then, she looked at me. Her head tilted slightly, and even with the mask, I could feel her gaze piercing through me. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, but unnervingly smooth. "Am I beautiful?" she asked softly, her voice almost musical. I laughed nervously, taking a step back. "Yes," I said, thinking it was the quickest way to end the conversation. But then she pulled down the mask. Her face was split from ear to ear, the corners of her mouth carved into a grotesque, jagged smile. The flesh was raw, glistening under the sickly light. She held a pair of scissors in her hand, their blades gleaming. "How about now?" she asked, her voice colder, sharper. Panic surged through me, but I remembered the stories. If you said no, she would kill you. If you said yes, she would make you look like her. Thinking quickly, I stammered, "You're average." She froze, tilting her head in confusion. That moment was all I needed. I turned and ran, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. But then, the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. I peered through the peephole, my stomach dropping as I saw her standing there, her smile wider than ever. "I'll come back," she whispered, her voice cutting through the wood like a blade. She hasn't come yet, but every night I hear the knocking. Have you ever entered a place and felt it wanted you to stay forever? I did, and I almost didn't leave. My friends and I had always heard about the haunting reputation of Aokigahara, the sea of trees at the base of Mount Fuji. It was a place of tragic endings, where countless souls had vanished or taken their own lives. But we weren't there to mourn. We were there to explore and prove we weren't afraid. The forest was eerily quiet, its dense canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper we ventured, the more we noticed the oddities. Torn ribbons tied to trees, abandoned belongings, and a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed down on us like a weight. But then, we found the cabin. It was old and weathered, its wooden walls warped and moss-covered. The door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for us. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. A single red-painted room stood at the back, its door slightly ajar. "I dare you to check it out," one of my friends whispered, trying to sound brave. I rolled my eyes, but agreed, stepping into the crimson-lit space. The walls were painted a deep, unsettling red, and in the center of the room sat a mirror, cracked, yet reflecting the dim light. But then I saw her. She was in the mirror, though no one was behind me. A woman in a tattered white dress, her hair tangled and soaked, as if she had emerged from water. Her head tilted sharply to one side, and her eyes were hollow, endless pits of darkness. Before I could move, she whispered, "Stay with me." The door slammed shut, and the room grew colder, the red walls seeming to pulse like a beating heart. I pounded on the door, screaming for my friends, but their voices were distant, fading, as though the room had swallowed me whole. But then, she stepped out of the mirror. Her hand reached for me, her icy fingers brushing my arm. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping, as if the room itself was pulling me into its crimson depths. Just as I thought I was lost, the door burst open. My friends yanked me out, dragging me back into the forest. When we reached the edge of the woods, I looked back. The cabin was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of trees. I still dream of her sometimes, her voice echoing in my head, "Stay with me." And every morning, I wake to find red smears on my mirror. Have you ever seen someone in a crowd who seemed out of place, like they didn't belong in this world? I have, and she still haunts me. It happened on a rainy evening in Tokyo. I had missed the last train and decided to walk home despite the downpour. The streets were deserted, the only sounds the patter of rain and the occasional splash of my footsteps. But then, I noticed her. A woman in a black kimono, standing perfectly still at the far end of the street, holding an old-fashioned black umbrella. Her head was bowed, and her long, wet hair obscured her face. I thought she was just another stranded commuter, but something about her felt wrong. As I passed her, I felt an unnatural chill seep into my bones, colder than the rain. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between us. But then I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, splashing in the puddles I had just walked through. I turned, my heart pounding. She was there, closer than before, her umbrella tilted slightly so I could glimpse her face, or rather, the lack of it. Her face was featureless, a smooth, pale void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The black umbrella tilted further, and a raspy, hollow voice emerged from nowhere. "Why are you running?" I stumbled back, tripping over the curb as she took another step toward me. Her umbrella seemed to expand, the edges curling unnaturally as if it could swallow the entire street. Shadows spilled out from beneath it, pooling around her feet and reaching toward me. "I just want to share the rain," she whispered, her voice echoing like a faint breeze. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the shadows licking at my heels. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and collapsed on the floor, drenched and trembling. The next day, I convinced myself it was a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and the storm. But every time it rains, I see her. Standing at the corner of the street, her black umbrella shielding her from the downpour, waiting for me to walk by again.